because it's a funny story.
Please do then.
I was working at Jim Bede's. I was director of development, which means working for me is coming as a brand new guy. Working for me was Bede's designers, his test team, and his test pilot. Now, the test pilot was a figurehead. His name is Gene Soucy. You know who Gene Soucy is. Jim wouldn't let Gene Soucy go to the first flight because Gene Soucy had a lot of friends, and he was worried that if something bad was wrong with the BD-5, that Gene would tell all of his friends and it would get out. So Jim Bede's chief test pilot didn't fly the airplane's first flights. He wasn't allowed to be there. That gives you kind of a snapshot of the Bede organization, okay? I didn't say that while Jim was still alive. I just didn't feel it was you know, right to be that candid, let's say. In fact, I covered this very candidly in my talk on Thursday noon called Struggles of a Retired Airplane Designer. And you want me to just kind of outline what I said there?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
First of all, I'll tell you the bottom line before I tell you anything else. And the bottom line is that I think possibly that my little company, Rutan Aircraft Factory, may not have been successful if it weren't for the fact that I worked for Jim Bede for a couple of years. Because I could apply the things that he did wrong and make darn sure that I didn't do them also. You know, for example, he would take money from someone for them to buy something, and he didn't know how much it cost. He'd sell a full kit for BD-5, engine, propeller, everything, and he had absolutely no idea how much it cost him to buy the materials and put it in boxes and ship it to them. And he found himself, while I was there that 2 years, he found himself firing his chief financial officer, accountant, that would come in and tell him, Jim, you got a problem here. We pay more for the materials that you buy than you're charging the people for the kit. And so he'd fire him. And the next guy that came in that told him that, he says, don't worry, Cessna and Beech do this. They lose money on the airplane, but they make it up when they sell them avionics. You know, I listened to this kind of stuff, and I worried about, you know, how long is this business going to last when he's out there still selling these things at this ridiculous low price, and he knows that it'll bankrupt him. And that's the reason I scampered. I wanted to get out of there before the collapse, you know. I thought he would collapse within a year. He did something extremely unethical before I left. And that is, he defined something that didn't exist, and he took big deposits on it from hundreds of people. And that thing was a BD-5D. It was a certified production BD-5. And the test program and certification program would be done in New Zealand because their FAA is presumably easier. And he was going to mass produce these things, and you could buy a completed BD-5, and here's what it cost. And you send in, I don't know, 10, 15% of that as a deposit. And to make it so that a lot of people would buy it, he said the deposit is fully refundable. Right? And then he played a trick called the Red Carpet Club that traded that refundable deposit for a membership in a club. And if you were in the club, you get a discount on your airplane by the amount of the deposit, so therefore it didn't cost you anything. And you get a few other bennies. And all these people, not all of them, but a bunch of them bought it, not knowing that they had traded a refundable deposit for membership in a club. So Jim made several $1,000,000 in just a couple or 3 weeks by stealing people's refundable deposits. And those kind of things is a reason I wanted to get the hell out of Jim was still alive, because he remained a friend. While I worked for him, I didn't think he was that corrupt. After I left there, I was horrified. Let me give you an example. We came to a point where this real cheap snowmobile engine, which he had to use because he didn't charge enough for a good one on the kit. It was called a Hearth. Snowmobile engine, and it only Hearth for a little while was the joke, see. And if it'd get hot and then it would seize, the piston would weld itself to the cylinder and whatever. And we were out there trying all kinds of things, different fans to cool it and different carburetor deals. And we had a test stand of a BD5 with a propeller on it. And Dan Cooney would stay out there and stay all night and run this thing, measuring where the temperature, and he'd run it, and we had problems. The belts would fail. We had all these problems, and but the big problem was we just couldn't. In a snowmobile, you might give it full power, but just for a couple seconds, now you're going too fast. So most of the time, you're running it at low power. Well, in an airplane, you need to give it full power and climb all the way to altitude. You're going to put it in several minutes of continuous full power, and it couldn't do that. In other words, it couldn't be an aircraft engine, right? And we all knew that. And of course, the solution might be, well, buy an engine that's water-cooled, or buy something, he couldn't afford it. So we're all depressed. When I say all, I'm talking about 70 or 80 people. Maybe at that time, 50 or 60, see. So thinking, well, we're going to lose our jobs because we're going under, right? Jim Bede decided to buy everybody lunch. And he cleared off an area of the plant there where they were loading stuff in the, they'd sell a kit for a wing and a tail before the airplane was known to be okay, and they ship it out, right? Anyway, so he laid out all these tables, tablecloths and whatever, and he was buying the company lunch. And he laid out this table, and he had disassembled one of the Hearth engines into every part, like a crankshaft, a rod, pistons, piston rings, the carburetor, the case. He laid out all these pieces out in front of him. He says, I want to assure you that our problems are ones that are easy to fix. And he picked up the crankshaft and he says, see this? It's the heaviest, most expensive part of this engine. And it's absolutely perfect. Never failed. Probably never will fail. Wow. Hooray. And then he'd pick up the rod or something, he'd pick up pieces of it, and he waited to pick up the piston, which was melted where it seized. He did that last. And he says, look at this piston. It is almost perfect. The bearing for the rod, look at that. Man, it lubricates perfect. It was well designed. And this thing is almost perfect. The only thing wrong is this little area here, pointing to where it had melted. He said, that's going to be easy to solve. It's just a tiny bit of this engine. So don't worry about it. We're going to fix this. And everybody in the company is cheering. Yay! Don't worry. Jim says, everything is fine. We're going to be profitable. We're going to grow. There'll be tens of thousands of these kits flying. And he was a cheerleader like you wouldn't believe. And that's kind of a little bit of what life was like there for those 2 years.
And
I'm going to save the better stories for my biography, so you're not going to get them here.
That's fair.
Before I met Jim Bede in February of 1972, when he brought his Bede 4 to my local airport, he's taken it all over the country to try to sell kits for the Bede 4. And in those days, you had to pay $5 to buy the information kit on the Bede 5. You know, stuff that they pass out as brochures now. If you want to find out all the details on it, give me $5. And that's how they were funding. These guys that were trying to market things early, they had to sell their own advertising materials, and they could do that if they had something exciting, like a Bede 5, right? Well, every one of my customers for my kit would buy a Bede 5 kit. I wasn't thinking liability in those days, but frankly, he wouldn't have much liability compared to him selling a Bede 5 kit. Right. Again, I wasn't thinking lawyerly in those days, but my idea is I could have a simple inventory, and I would just move a few parts, and that to get the shape of the fuselage would have to be different. I could do it in composites. So I had this plan before I met Jim Bede, and I bought a Bede 5B kit. Okay, then a month later, I met Jim Bede, and I showed him my very vegan pictures. Hadn't flown yet, right? I'm an EAA Chapter 49 guy, and hey, I'm building an unusual airplane, Mr. Bede, and you want to see it? Here it is, see? And he says, well, what do you do? I says, well, I'm a flight test engineer. I do flight testing of military airplanes. And his eyes got this big, and here's this guy that's building a home-built airplane. Okay. In fact, he's got it almost done. It's unusual. And he's a professional flight test military guy. And he told me right on the spot, he says, I need a test pilot and I want to hire you. I didn't know it at the time, but he knew that he wouldn't let his test pilot fly his airplane, right? Jim Soucy was a figurehead because he was a national aerobatic champion. And it was neat to advertise that he's the chief test pilot. And he did in his newsletters. I didn't know any of that, right? But he wants to hire me as a test pilot. And I looked at him, I says, I'm sorry, Jim, I'm not a test pilot. I'm a test engineer, and I'm a developer. I'm not a test pilot, but if you hire me, I would make my job director of development, and I would supervise your designers, but I would hire the best guy for the job. I would hire the test pilot. Long story short, he accepted that. He accepted to pay me the same salary I was making at the Air Force, which by that time was $18,000 a year. And he wrote me an offer and agreed to pay my moving expenses and whatever, and I got a new job. So I'm moving my family to Kansas. Now, in those days, Jim Bede didn't work full-time in Kansas. He was still Cuyahoga Fats. He worked in Cleveland. And he would come to Newton just for engineering design reviews or certainly for flight tests and whatever. But he wasn't there when I showed up. So I showed up and I went to work for the first day on the job. And knowing that now I am director of development and everybody in this building works under me. The engineers, flight test people, everything, and I accepted that job because I wanted that kind of authority. I wanted to take on something that I don't. Today it puzzles me how much courage I had to think that I could take a job from a government job and I could now be a director of development of an airplane development company, and the hottest one in the world at the time in terms of sales. I walked into the building, and I introduced myself to the receptionist, and she didn't know who I was. I walked further into the building. I found the HR guy who does the paychecks and whatever. And I went into engineering. They didn't know who I was. And I looked around, and there's no office. I don't know where I'd put my stuff. I need a desk, and I got a lot of, got my slide rule and my manuals and whatever. Where's my office? People didn't know who I was. So I got on the phone, I called Jim Bede, and I says, well, I'm here. It doesn't sound like you grease the skids for me, but I need you to solve a problem right now, and that is, where do I move into? And he says, take my office. I'm just there part-time, and move into my office. Okay, so now with all these people looking around, Burt Rutan is moving his stuff into Jim Bede's office. I got to go through his drawers in his desk. They weren't locked. Probably shouldn't have, but I found out that the reason this 40-horse snowmobile engine airplane could go 240 miles an hour was that Jim had assumed that the entire airplane was laminar flow, not just 50% of the wing. He had assumed there was no cooling drag, and he assumed there's no gaps of the gear doors or something. He essentially took something, the shape of the outside of the airplane, and he says, this thing looks so pretty. The shape is so gorgeous that it's absolutely perfect, and therefore it's all laminar flow. And that's the basis, and I saw that written down, that's the basis for his advertising to sell to the public a kit airplane with only 40 horsepower that you could do 240. And I'm looking forward to the time in which I sit down and discuss reality to Jim. Okay. The airplane had flown by then. It lifted off with Jim Bede being in the airplane and Gene Soucy being out of town. It lifted off the ground, it turned sideways, and it crashed back onto the ground, and Jim Bede put out a new newsletter that says, we've discovered something really cool. And we discovered it by accident. Is the exhaust we send out the side is so powerful, because this is a small airplane, that it yaws the airplane to the left. And what we're going to do, we're going to turn it around out the back, and we'll get even more performance. That's in a newsletter. They had a tail in the airplane that was not a V-tail, but it still was not a good. In fact, I'd never seen it before. In the museum, in this building, is an airplane that says N500BD. No, I'm sorry. I think it's N501BD. I forgot what, but it doesn't have a V-tail, but it has this highly swept horizontal, which didn't work. And that was an early version of it, obviously restored. And I don't want to go into all the details about the engineering status of the BD-5 when I came on board. I want to do that in my bio for lessons learned for airplane designers and so on, but that would take way too long. But bottom line, the kind of statement that was occasionally said was, well, didn't anybody calculate this? And we noticed in the newsletters that Jim was promising things, a very unusual schedule, it's almost like, who's the other Bede, Sir Richard Branson, promised when he was going to fly people to space. and actually wrote on his chalkboard behind his desk. Let me see if I get it right. The difficult we do immediately. The impossible takes 2 weeks. No, wait a minute. The difficult we do immediately. The impossible we advertise.
Oh, the impossible.
And it's a joke. I mean, you know, I wasn't. And if you talk to the people, you know, privately, if you're having lunch with them, it's not a. It wasn't it wasn't hidden, the fact that we were trying to do things that wouldn't work. But everybody had this feeling that if it only works half as good as Jim Bede says, just half, it'd still be a real successful project. It's okay if it only goes 170 instead of 240, right? Who cares? And that's what kept everybody together and kept everybody with a passion.